Hey, hi everyone. I am here with Dr. Hannah Stolze, author of a new favorite that I have, Wisdom Based Business. So, Hannah, it is great. We've been friends for a number of years. The very fact that I get the chance to interview you now on your newest book is exciting and an honor for me. So, thanks for coming on.
Yeah, thank you, Tommy. I'm excited for our conversation.
Well, before we talk about your book, tell me, when I think of you, I've watched, you've had your career in military, now in academics, and you've become quite the entrepreneur. Share with me a little bit about your journey and then what you're doing right now.
Yeah, so if we weren't Christians, we say I've had a very opportunistic and lucky trajectory in life. We know, of course, that there's more to our path than just that. But I actually totally not strategic at all. Enlisted in the Army out of high school, really because my dad had cancer. And it was a huge step back for our family financially. He worked through it. My dad was a carpenter and a worship pastor. And both of my sisters are phenomenal musicians. And so they had full rides in music, and I'm not musically talented. So I decided the way I was going to pay for school was to go enlist and get my undergrad paid for, and then go go green to gold and get law school covered. And God just had other plans for my life. I tested in, I guess, high enough in my year. You never know why you get the job you get. But I started out in psychological operations, and as a PsyOps specialist, you have to language qualify. So everyone in PsyOps in the Army has to have a language proficiency. And where you do your language proficiency is determined by your test scores. And my only two choices were Mandarin or Arabic. And I really wanted to get through my undergrad. So I figured if I learned Mandarin, I'd be less likely to get deployed, because we don't go to war with China. And so that really shaped what I chose for my undergrad. And I double majored in political economics, pre-law, and Mandarin because of my Army trajectory. And through my time in the Army, I had a couple different jobs. Actually had my first supply chain job in the military. I was switched into ordnance. And my final position in the military was in broadcast journalism. So I was a broadcast journalist for a couple of years. And I had a first sergeant in broadcast journalism who just was a really amazing, God brings all kinds of different amazing people into our lives and across our paths. And she said, you could go into debt for a law degree, but I think I could get you an MBA for free. And I was like, oh, free MBA sounds good. And that was my introduction to business. I got an MBA through the military, and I got into it and realized I didn't know anything about supply chain management, which is really, my core field now. And got into it and realized, wow, there's a lot of business that's happening upstream. It's not just the consumer facing side that we see in the retail and Amazon world, and it's really global. So imagine, I'm a Mandarin proficient, no longer, but back then, 20 years ago, Mandarin proficient with an MBA. So it was a perfect fit for me to start working in my interim years. I actually ran operations for an importer. So we had all their buying out of Asia, and then really realized that I wanted to do more research and writing. I love writing. And the only way for me to do that full time without going the consulting route was to get a doctorate. And so, I say I kind of meandered into, really a calling and something that I know that I'm really passionate about now, teaching and researching and writing. But it definitely, I had no clue, and God's hand was so on it, which is really amazing.
Very, very good. It is interesting because a lot of times you probably didn't think that when you were in broadcast journalism, you would be a professor or teaching or getting your MBA. You just don't know a lot of times where life is you're just faithful to where God has placed you at that point. Wouldn't you say, Hannah?
Absolutely. And there's so many jobs that you're in, and in the moment, they're so frustrating, and you're like, man, this job is not tapping all that I can do, or, you show up every day and it's, I literally lived in the field when I was in ordnance. I built and maintained explosive warehouses for 2 years. Yeah. And it wasn't something I enjoyed doing at all. But without that, I wouldn't have any tactical supply chain experience.
Yeah. I would probably say it's like my years of building cell towers for about 10 to 12 years. Never thought I would be building cell towers, but those years building cell towers created me the ability to think, to organize, to lay everything on spreadsheets, to learn how to manage different people. It set the stage for what I'm doing right now. It allowed me to be more efficient in what I'm doing right now.
Yeah, I love that, that when you're faithful with a little,
Yeah.
you can be faithful with much more. And, you look back and you think, man, all of the skills that I learned each step along the
Yeah.
way, I had no idea why I was doing it then, but now it kind of makes sense.
Hannah, when you were a little girl, just playing with toys and growing up, what did you want to do?
So I grew up my parents were post-missionary. I'll say post-missionary. My parents lived in Iran up until the Civil War.
Yeah.
So I actually grew up in the US, but they had come back from the Middle East. And we grew up with no television. My dad's family was Amish Mennonite. And so I didn't grow up Amish Mennonite, but some of that kind of carried forward. So we had no TV. My mom was a reading and English teacher. So all we did was read. And so as a little girl, I was obsessed with reading. And my whole life, I've prayed for Asia. I have no idea why. Everybody in my family, my parents worked in the Middle East. My uncle and aunt worked in India and all over the Middle East, and had a very missions kind of oriented family. And since I was a little tiny girl, I loved Ellen Montgomery, and my dream was to run an orphanage in China. That was my dream as like a 5-year-old.
Wow, interesting. And here you are, because now you are wearing multiple hats, one with Wheaton College with the Center of Faith and Innovation, then with Lipscomb University, and you've also done a lot of traveling in Jakarta as well too. Tell me a little bit of what you're doing right now and even your experience in Jakarta last year.
Yeah, so last year I had this opportunity and always going full circle, right? Because I had a few years where I actually had a few years really early on, right out of undergrad. I thought I was going to move to China. I thought I was going to teach over there. And instead of doing that, I actually ended up a single mom, totally unexpected. And it shifted the entire trajectory of my career. It's part of the reason I got the MBA when I did. And in that season, really realizing that international travel was going to go away. The opportunities were going to go away as I really focused on raising my son. I met my husband, had my daughter, and then raising kids. And just 5 years ago, for the first time, I had an invitation through a colleague, Paul Lee as well, a professor at Wheaton College, to go and teach in Southeast Asia. And it was really amazing because it was something I felt like I laid down. Like, this probably isn't going to happen in my life now. And God has a way of restoring dreams that we had as small children that we think aren't going to happen when we're adults. And so one of our goals, my husband and I, was to have our kids have a full immersion experience in a culture very different to the US. And so about 2 years ago, going up for sabbatical, I applied for a Fulbright through the State Department and was awarded one. So I applied for one in Indonesia. We have some ties with the university there through Wheaton College. It's called UPH. And I had the opportunity to go over and to teach some global supply chain classes and be embedded there for a semester with my kids, with my family back in Asia, in actually a Chinese expat area where a lot of ethnic Chinese live. Pretty exciting.
Yeah. And, when I tell people you and I have traded stories about Jakarta, because I travel there quite a lot, Hannah, when I tell people that I'm off to Jakarta or I'm doing work in Jakarta, no one understands Jakarta. Everyone's wondering, is it a third world country? Is it Micronesia or other? Tell me about Indonesia. Tell me about your experience and what you're seeing about the city of Jakarta.
Oh my goodness. And Indonesia is so much fun because it's so different to everything we teach in business in America. So think about it this way. Like my doctorate's in logistics.
Yes.
So I teach supply chain management, you're thinking transportation, warehousing, inventory, and I won't get into that because that'd be a really boring interview. But when you go to Indonesia, the US, we have a huge, massive amount of land that's connected by rail systems and highways. And it's really, really easy to get economies of scale and to move lots of product across the US. We're very strategic. You go to Indonesia and I think at high tide, there are 17,000 islands. At low tide, 22,000 islands. And the population is spread over, a nation that's as big as as Australia, right? In breadth. And every product that gets delivered in Indonesia, for the most part, is going to move by truck, by water, by plane. Everything's intermodal. Everything is way more complex. They have a lot of intermediaries we don't have. So it was really fun and kind of humbling, actually, to teach supply chain strategy in an exec ed space, exec MBA kind of space, in a totally different context to people with totally different resources, how we approach it in the US.
Very good. And for when you were teaching with that, is how did culture play a role in it? What did you have to change that's different from teaching here in the US versus teaching in an Asian context?
Well, obviously, like building relationships looks totally different in Indonesia, and how you move product. And get this, when I taught my first global supply chain class, I had an MBA group in Semanggi, so in Jakarta. I was commuting in. I had 60 students, and 40 of the 60 were doctors or hospital administrators. So February of 2020. So COVID is hitting. And I'm talking about risk management. How do you do risk analysis? And on the old risk models, when you look at, what are the things that is going to go wrong, in the US, usually it's like a demand and supply mismatch. And my students in Indonesia said their biggest concern wasn't demand and supply mismatches. It was actually corruption. And political issues. Like, where's the risk in getting your product? And so it's there's totally different dynamics at play in the game.
Yeah. And Hannah, wouldn't you say a lot of times I've been there and have so many conversations with our young leaders. Corruption is a huge thing. Bribery is a huge thing. Law prevents bribery from happening in the US. There are no laws at times over at Jakarta. So will you make the bribe? Will you not make the bribe? But if you don't make the bribe, you're losing $10 million or $3 million, which decimates your entire company.
Yeah. It's a huge challenge in terms of thinking about stakeholders differently and knowing which intermediaries you need to navigate. And to be honest, this is why relationships are so important in that space. And we spent a lot of time talking about relationship building and how do you get access to the things that you need. Because there were hospital administrators, they were trying to figure out how to get access to ventilators, to pharmaceutical products that was going to the US and the West first. So and they need this for their customers. It's not wrong to need these products to get them into the marketplace, but you have to figure out how you're going to navigate that. So really fun, really complex, and really humbling to say, you know what? We might think that we have it all figured out in the US sometimes, but our systems don't always work everywhere in the world.
And I would say one thing about Jakarta for those who are listening, and we have lots of dear friends over there. It's a city of 12 million people. It is divided between Chinese, Indonesian, ethnic Indonesians, a bunch of different cultures. You suddenly have a new airport. Traffic is a huge concern over there. The inefficiencies at times, but the growing infrastructure that they're trying to create order of it sometimes will make it hard. But it is a city where there are so many startups, so many wonderful leaders, what they call unicorns as businesses that are suddenly growing. It is a wonderful, wonderful, impactful city.
It's so amazing. And I think honestly, especially with e-commerce and the ways that they've leapt into the delivery space, when you look at the Grab and all of the different companies that have popped up in Southeast Asia, they have potential to leapfrog us in terms of understanding e-commerce and delivery and all those spaces, because they have to be agile and creative and flexible. It's a really exciting place to be in, isn't it, Tommy?
It is. Hey, let's switch gears a little bit and talk about wisdom-based business. Talk about the journey in writing this book.
Yeah, it's really fun because I really, if you're listening and you kind of know the evangelical language, like I thought the doctorate was more like a tent making move, that the PhD would give me access to travel internationally and do work and be able to serve everywhere I went. And I didn't necessarily see business in and of itself as kingdom work or ministry. I thought it would be something that would allow me to serve, right? And when I started doing research really early on in my PhD, I was working on a Department of Defense grant looking at lean, green, and global supply chain. So looking at environmental strategies and lean implementation in a global supply chain. And we interviewed, I think, 50 to 60 companies in that project for the Department of Defense. And as I sat at the table with all of these really profitable organizations, and they talked about why they were doing total quality management, why they were implementing environmental strategies. Their reasoning behind doing it, was bettering their employees' experiences and really stewarding. And they use the language of stewarding, the natural environment, the next generation. And as I listened, I said, man, these strategies are actually really biblical. And not only are they really biblical, but these executives are articulating that these strategies help them to meet their customers' needs and what their customers want, as well as reducing cost. So they're building revenue, reducing cost. And, if you build revenue and reduce cost, now you're improving your profit margin, right? And I wonder if anybody is teaching Christians that you can apply scripture in ways that makes you not only better in business, but more competitive in business. And so I feel like actually this book is in some ways exploring scripture to reclaim biblical principles for Christians that do work in business. Yeah. And that was really the kind of the short story of the 10 years I've spent writing this book.
Hannah, as people ask you, profit, a lot of times Christians struggle with profit. They don't like talking about profit. Is profit good? What would you say to them as a Christian?
This is, it's so interesting that I've had the opportunity to talk about profit so much through this book launch. And I love it because there's a lot of different ways to think about profit. And my favorite scriptural example is the book of Ruth.
Yeah.
And when we think about the book of Ruth, everybody always thinks about Boaz, right? Because Boaz, if you're not, super familiar, Boaz is this wealthy farmer who has employees and managers working for him. And he has enough crops that he's able to have margin around his fields that the poor can come and glean. So he has profit, he has excess margin in his fields. And so a lot of times we think about Boaz as being profitable, but throughout that story, the main character of the book, Ruth, the Moabite widow who comes back with her mother-in-law, Naomi, to Bethlehem, actually she's in poverty, right? She has no belongings, she has no resources of her own. But throughout the book, she's able to work in the fields and always have enough for her and Naomi. And it even says when she goes to lunch, she eats her fill and then has a doggy bag. She has a take-home box that she brings home to Naomi. And so we think to have profit margin, you need to be at the pinnacle of your success or your competitiveness. And in the book of Ruth, we see margin in both Boaz and Ruth's work ethic. Yeah, that Boaz had profit, he had margin for the poor, but Ruth in her poverty was able to earn and work hard enough to create resources for herself and for Naomi. And so I love this when we get to the New Testament. Jesus talks a lot about what do we do with our resources? And you have to have them. If you want to share with the poor and feed the hungry and give drinks to the thirsty, well, you have to have a little bit extra, right?
Very good.
And that's what profit gives us.
And in Proverbs 31 for you about the noble woman, it acts as the foundation for everything that you're writing. Talk to me about Proverbs 31, the noble woman.
Yeah, I love it. I love this passage. And this was my biggest journey in writing the book. Because Proverbs 31 has been taught so specifically in a certain way in the church. So I grew up Proverbs 31 was the model for the Christian woman. Yeah. Right. And I didn't realize I had the opportunity while I was on faculty at Wheaton to do the Masters of Bible program, which you don't need a master's in Bible to read the Word of God and to get revelation from it. But what it helped me to understand is that wisdom is introduced in Proverbs 1-9 as a woman.
Yes.
Lady Wisdom is compared to Lady Folly throughout the book. And in those first 9 chapters, about 11 of those verses actually set up this noble woman in Proverbs 31. So when you get to Proverbs 31, verses 10-31, these are actually a standalone acrostic in the Hebrew Bible. The A to Z of wisdom in action as this noble woman in the marketplace. Yeah. And so when you think about that, the A to Z, this is really the capstone of wisdom in action. And she's a woman. Again, Lady Wisdom is a woman. She's a noble woman. And the word noble, that chayel, means mighty and wealthy and competitive, which we never hear it translated that way. And we think about her, and she's running a company. And, one of the reasons I love it as an example is not just household work. It's because she's actually sourcing raw materials outside of her garden. And so I had lots of people say, well, all of the women in the ancient, Near East had textiles and built this for their families. And I said, yeah, that's great. but she's actually going into the market to source
Yep.
wool and flax. So
Mm-hmm.
she's built it out bigger than what she can source herself. And she has these customers, these merchants that are buying her products as well. And I think that's really key to understanding this passage as an example of wisdom in action in a way that anybody in the church can learn from.
I love what you're saying. So in summary, what you're saying is a lot of times Proverbs personifies a wisdom, Lady Folly, in Noble Woman, and Proverbs 31 becomes the example of everything that Proverbs is talking about in the first 30 chapters.
Exactly. And it's so cool because Lady Wisdom always shows up in the public square.
Got
right?
it.
She's walking in the streets, crying out to the fools, and it's amazing to me that when we get to this, A to Z passage at the end of the book, wisdom isn't in a temple or on a throne. Wisdom is in business.
Correct.
I love this. 3,000 years ago, we had this entrepreneurial example of buying and selling and transforming and making products that people want to buy profitably.
Hannah, I was just telling you recently, I just used your Proverbs 31 as an example to a bunch of different teachers, and some of them were female. And so when they first studied this passage, they were looking at it with one set of eyes. They were telling me, well, the passage says to be a good wife, to be a homemaker. And so I challenged them, no, think through how can Proverbs 31 apply to all Christ followers? And now, once they looked at it, their eyes opened to the possibilities of what this passage says.
Yeah, it's pretty amazing. I mean, she's even she has merchants coming from afar, and knowing that Israel's like in a trade route. It's like a global supply chain 3,000 years ago.
Yes.
It is so much bigger and so much more exciting than what I was taught about this passage growing up.
Because there's some entrepreneurial spirit about her. You have this one thing, and it says, in verse 14, she is like the ships of the merchant. She brings her food from afar. That's not natural. You were expected to be a homemaker. You're expected to be in the home, take care of everything, to make sure your husband is taken care of. For her she's sourcing different things. She's thinking outside the box. She's not content with the standard norm.
Yeah. And I love it too in that passage, where it says with her profit, she's considering vineyards and she's buying fields. And women didn't even have land rights back then.
Yes.
So this is not a cultural thing that would have made sense outside of this being something more. And so you see that I love that with her profit, she's investing and she's expanding her portfolio of business. I mean, that sounds pretty entrepreneurial, doesn't it?
Very good. When you talk with people, how do people resonate? Do they understand where you're going with this?
Yeah, I think so. It's really interesting when you start looking at this passage and thinking about what are the business, what is she doing in business? What is the work that she's actually doing? And you start looking at the buying, the selling, the transformation, the giving to the poor, and all the things that she actually does. It's pretty hard to read the passage through that lens and not feel inspired to do business a little bit differently. And I think that's pretty exciting. Yeah.
Do you feel like, even with your current role with the Center of Faith and Innovation, do you feel like Christian marketplace leaders or even pastors are beginning to understand the importance of business or work compared to what it was 10 years ago? Or is it still a new thing for many people?
I think it depends on the space that you're in. There's I think in some academic spaces, it feels like we've kind of come to an agreement, right? In the theology space, there's now been a lot of years of the faith and work, like theological work. I think in the evangelical space, there's kind of this fine line between, full-on prosperity doctrine and an understanding of what we're called to in terms of serving God and serving people in the marketplace. And, there's a balance in all of that, right? In terms of what are we called to and what does it look like? So I think that there's a lot of realization over the last 5 to 10 years where it's gone from the ivory tower to Main Street. Can I say that? I think that's fair. There's some revelation and there's a lot of wow, that, God really cares about our work. Isn't it amazing that we don't have to just, work and earn money to support the ministry, but our work can actually be ministry no matter where God's called us. And I think the gap, and part of the reason I wrote the book, is the next question of how. What does it look like? And it's not enough to be an ethical person. In my research, I see so many business leaders who are not Christians, who I would say are totally virtuous and ethical
Yeah.
in business. And my heart is to see the church capture that and
Yeah.
really have a picture of what does it look like to do business ethically and virtuously in a way where we can really live out the great commands and the Great Commission.
Because it seemed like in the early 90s, Hannah, a lot of the conversation around this faith and work was, hey, let me just put a Bible verse on my wall. Let me have a calendar or scriptural verse. Let me have a Bible study. Let me share. It's actually evolved to the thing of who has God created you to be? What does it look like for you to be a supply chain professor? What does it look like for you to be an entrepreneur or CEO? How do you create a business that revitalizes your society or your community or your city so it's slowly evolving and developing?
It's so true. And I think, sometimes definitely in North America, for a lot of years, we had this really clear separation between church and state.
Correct.
And so you keep your faith life separate, right, from the work that you do in the public space. And sometimes we forget when we read wisdom literature in particular from 3,000 years ago, there was no separation between, being known as an Israelite and the work that you did. So wisdom literature and scripture talks a lot about business and how we do business. And if you don't believe me, read Proverbs 20 through 22. And it gets into the nitty gritty of pricing strategies and how do you treat your customers and your honesty and the quality of your products. And so it's not just about wearing a cross or being evangelistic. It's about demonstrating the gospel and how we love people in the marketplace as well.
Yep. And now, as a result, because of your book and the topics of your book and what we're dealing with, the global conversation changes, doesn't it? How we look at global missions, how churches need to look at global missions, because you suddenly have to rise as business leaders in those cities, changes how we used to do global missions.
Absolutely. I think it gives us a lot more opportunity to not only go in with a message, but to go in with opportunity to serve people around us. When you think about the opportunities to be an entrepreneur globally, not only do you go in with the heart and the message and the revelation of who Jesus is, but you also go in building capital and resources that you get to share life and build relationships, but also provide employment and products and really serve. Jesus didn't just offer salvation or healing. He fed people. He transformed water into wine and he multiplied loaves and fishes. Jesus cared about people's physical needs and met their needs with tangible products. And I think it's really exciting to think about business as a way that we can do this as well.
Yeah, very, very good. Hannah, thank you very much. I mean, I love talking with you. I love reading your book. I'm right in the midst of the book. And thank you very much for writing this book and coming on and talking about Proverbs 31.
Yeah, as you know, I love talking about it. I'm really passionate about this topic and encouraging people to read their Bibles and be strategic. If you're not purposeful in how you do business, it's going to happen one way or the other.
One last question. You talked about 10 years in the midst of writing this book. Now you're thinking about other iterations. What's going through your head? If you had to sit there and write more iterations of this book, what would you do differently? What would you add on to it?
Yeah, I think one of the things that's really exciting is this book. When I said I was reclaiming a lot of best practices in business that are biblical.
Yeah.
Well, wisdom and wisdom literature is also pretty universal. There's Confucian literature that's wisdom literature. There's Babylonian and Egyptian. I'm excited to see wisdom become more of a common terminology in business.
Yeah.
In both Christian and secular, non-faith-based spaces. So I think there's a lot of opportunity around wisdom and embracing wisdom as moving data to information, to knowledge, to understanding. And then we have to decide, what do we do with it with wisdom at the top? Yep. So I'm excited about that, excited about seeing some learning materials and resources come out of this, both in the Bible study space, but also in business planning. And who knows, maybe I will write a kid's book out of it and have a picture book on wisdom.
I would love it. Hey, Dr. Hannah Stolze, thank you very much for taking time out to talk. The 30 minutes went by really, really fast. So thank you.
Yeah, thank you. It was great talking about this with you today.
All right, talk soon.